Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage virtual summit in the days of COVID-19. We have an awesome panel coming up right now. It's the impact of COVID-19 on primaries and general election. And joining me, I've got Mark Kuhr, who you guys have seen on the show before. He is the ex-NSA officer and also the co-founder and CTO of Synack. Mark, how's it going, buddy?
It's going great. Great to be here, James.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming back, Mark. And I've got Jake Braun, who is the executive director for the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and Cyber Policy Initiative, and also the co-founder of the DEF CON Voting Village. Jake, welcome on the CyberHub Engage, man. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me.
I love the map of Chicago behind your head. Absolutely love it. It's great. So we are living in an unprecedented time. Who would have thunk it that we'd be doing this virtually instead of face to face? Like, it would have been so much better. But here we are on video. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on primaries and general elections. So generally, what are the security and elections integrity concerns as states really start to consider how to deal with running a presidential election? Right now, primary season, we still aren't done with the primaries. People want to say we are, but technically there's still, I think, 27 states that still need to run their primaries during a pandemic like this one. Whichever one of you guys wants to go first.
Well, I think I'll go ahead and start, and I'll hand it over to Jake. I think the main concern right now is around the physical and physical security and the health of the people going to vote, right? And so, how do we maintain, just like going to the grocery store, how do we maintain some sense of normalcy where people feel somewhat safe going to vote, keeping that social distance in place, and not just staying at home? So that effort to get the vote out, it's really important to make sure that the polling stations are set up in a way to allow for social distancing. In addition, I mean, remote, by mail voting has been a reliable and secure way of doing voting for many decades, and I think more of that should be done, and that will continue to be more prevalent as we, enter a season where we can't have people congregating in polling stations.
Yeah, I certainly agree with both those points. I think expanding the access to absentee voting is critically important. I think one of the big concerns there is in states where absentee is a smaller part of the overall vote share. Do they have enough machines to get through the tallying quickly? And if machines break, are you able to bring in other machines to tally the absentee votes quickly? Because in many cases you've got one big machine for a whole county, and that can cause problems, especially with everybody demanding that they have immediate results. If the polls close at 8 o'clock, that they have results by 8:01. The volume of absentee votes can be a challenge. I mean, we at DEF CON have found multiple vulnerabilities with a lot of the machines that do count these absentee ballots. Although we still believe that the hand-marked paper ballots are the most secure, and so we fully support expanding this paper absentee ballots. Secondly, I think the other thing that we're really concerned about is the disinformation being spread by either foreign actors or local or domestic folks trying to tell people not to vote. That maybe they shouldn't even take an absentee ballot because that could have COVID on it or something like that, which is of course nonsense. And so that's a big concern of ours is the disinformation that drives down turnout.
When you think of that kind of level of disinformation, and you look at the resources that counties actually have to deal with it, it's almost impossible for them to be able to deal with something of this scale. Should the federal government get involved here? And then if so, in what way? Because that tends to kind of put a damper on elections if federal government has their hands deep in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the federal government has passed legislation to allocate millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to this problem, and the states need to go forth and get the grants to roll out safe voting procedures. There's certainly lots of room to improve absentee voting. I think one of the things that we have to make sure about is just voter education and have reliable voter education. And a lot of that, the funds to secure our elections should be both on voter education, but on also the security of carrying out the vote tallying and making people realize that their vote does count and there is integrity in this process. The federal government can step in and provide funding that gives the states plenty of money to fix this problem. We just need to go ahead and do it.
Yeah, agreed. I think, the last thing that we want, and it'd be too late to do it even if we wanted to, would be to have the federal government try and help with the implementation itself. That can't and shouldn't happen.
Right.
I think, certainly more funding for expanding absentee would be good. However, I do think that one of the things the federal government can and should do more of is kind of expanding on this concept from the Cold War of deterrence, which I think has not really been adapted to the modern times in thinking through cybersecurity and cyber conflict. But I do think that it is the job of the federal government and the national security establishment to, raise the stakes for anybody who wants to come in and spread disinformation, hack our election infrastructure, mess with unofficial results, and so on and so forth. So they know that they're going to pay a big price if if they come in and try and do something like that. And I know from, again, this is publicly reported stuff. I don't know anything outside of that. That NSA and others did have operations like that going on in 18 to let folks know that we're not just going to sit back and let them come in and spread disinformation and do all kinds of bad things around our election. I think that should be expanded and enhanced because cyber deterrence is a real thing that we need to expand, especially around our elections. And by the way, academia, who played a big role in thinking through deterrence during the Cold War and the implications of it back then, also needs to step up and spend a lot more time thinking through what cyber deterrence means for the future.
So as you kind of we talked a little bit and you guys both mentioned kind of cyber deterrence from a federal government level. Where does deterrence more or less lie? And then should the government be doing deterrence in terms of a policy issue, or should it be more of a national security issue?
Well, it's going to be any kind of deterrence is going to have to be a combination of military and policy and even financial. You're going to be imposing sanctions on these countries that are carrying out these attacks. You're going to be conducting, through the U.S. Cyber Command, Computer Network Attack Authority. You're going to be conducting attacks to shut down these actors, make sure they can't connect to platforms that will allow them to disseminate to a great extent their messages. And then you're going to be looking at how to bring a policy framework around how we interact with them going forward. Does it impact our trade with them? Does it impact who we ally with long term? There has to be strategic ramifications for that actor, and that's really the only way that they're going to stop doing it. And then of course you have your offensive measures from a cyber perspective, but also from just an education perspective to the voter. I think the federal government could do a lot more to just help U.S. companies defend themselves, give them the knowledge through information sharing initiatives about these attacks, because to many local governments and even corporations in the states, they're just not equipped to counter that type of foreign adversary with a nation state level budget. They may not have the skills, they may not have the budget, they may not have the wherewithal to understand that what looks like a normal advertisement buy is actually an actor performing some suppression of some population in our populace.
Right. Yeah, and I think it we're even starting to see in 2020 instances of this that go beyond 2016. So for example, right here in Illinois, NBC News reported that there was a fake Cook County Board of Elections website that was set up by, we're not sure who, to disseminate God only knows what. I mean, if it was Russians or Russian copycats, we know that in the Ukraine in 2014, they put out fake election results. So it could have been used to do that on the night of the Illinois primary. Fortunately, they caught the site and took it down. It could have been used to disseminate fake polling location changes or fake hours, all kinds of stuff. So I think that the folks administering the election really, they just don't stand a chance against a nation state. But I do think back to the deterrence point, one of the key things that's key tools in our toolbox that we really do need to leverage more so than I believe we have is bringing together other democratic countries to, fight against this, publicly call it out. So when this happens in France or Germany, all of the democratic countries in the world are calling out whoever's doing it. When it's happening to us, you've got the entire EU and the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Nigerians and the Mexican government and everybody else saying, this is not okay. And we have yet to do that. And traditionally, that's America's job. I mean, we're
Yeah.
the one who leads, big communities of nations to stand up to bad guys on this stuff, and we need to do that again.
And I think, to push on that, excuse me, even further. I mean, this is the easy fight, right? Fighting information in some regards is the easier part of this from a technical perspective. What I worry about is if we go full bore into electronic voting, internet voting, you're going to end up with actors that hack, and then they sleep and wait until the night of the election when all the votes need to be in, or some surge in, elections are coming in or votes are coming in, and they take a power grid down, and you've got an outage. So it leads to integrity question in the election when stuff like that happens that looks accidental. It's always going to have some element of deniability. There's always going to be some other conspiracy theory out there that it was just an accident. But if you look at what happened in Georgia, where they've got actors taking out the nation of Georgia, taking out power grids, this is a real concern. And pre-positioning and being strategic with your cyber weapons is something that our adversaries are getting very, very good at. And frankly, our local and state initiatives are not sufficient to seek out these vulnerabilities, and not sufficient to really secure our supply chain of election voting infrastructure.
And so that kind of brings it to the fact that a lot of security experts think that voting by mail, as we were talking about a little bit ago, to be one of probably the most secure forms of voting. I know there are others who would disagree with that, who say it's really easy to do ballot fraud. You don't know if someone is still alive or if they've passed in the period from the time they've registered to the time they get their ballot. And so are there vulnerabilities in voting by mail that states should be aware of? And then what are some of those hidden risks?
To vote by mail?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say that the vote by mail is, you're mainly concerned with voter registration fraud, right? And so the concern I would have there is that you've got voters on the rolls through electronic databases that have been, compromised, or you've populated a lot of voters onto the rolls. Now, I think that risk is relatively low given the checks and balances in the system, which is why it's a preferred method for more voting. I think also, back to Jake's point earlier, the absentee vote tallying is something I would be a little concerned about. And a lot of times those absentee votes aren't counted until the election is super close, because they don't have the capacity to count them in near real time. So I think it's kind of a twofold problem. If we can solve the vote counting challenges, I think vote by mail is a great alternative.
Jake, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the bigger risk, so, in terms of mailing back ballots and all that type of stuff, I mean, we've been doing that for decades or longer. And so, there's not a huge concern there. I do think it goes back to the databases. If we were to mail out ballots to everybody, and the bad guys wanted to, get in and mess with the databases in advance, that would be a concern. And it's one of these things where we know that they already have, at the very least, accessed and exfiltrated data from our databases. No one's been able to come in and say for sure whether they've done anything else, at least not publicly. But we certainly know they've gotten in and despite all the claims that these databases, these voter registration databases are quote unquote air gapped, which I know is like a laughable term on a show like this, but in the general public, people hear that and take it at face value. Um, Despite the fact that supposedly they're air gapped, we found out that from the Mueller report on page 50, by the way, that the way the Russians got into the voter registration databases was from a basic SQL injection onto the websites of the election officials, and then were able to worm their way into the voter uh, election administration software, and then into the database, and then so on from there. So, I don't think messing with the databases is unique specifically to absentee voting, but it would certainly compound the problems that you could cause with the database if the way everybody was getting their ballot was via mail.
So that kind of takes us where the only solution to this is almost going back 150 years, and voting in the method of 150 years ago. But we live in 2020, it's a technological era, and online voting is something that several countries do, like Estonia, for example, and several others. Are there any models that we as the US should be looking at now seriously, and trying to invest our resources in terms of ensuring that we might be able to run a voting online for should this pandemic hit again around
I
election
mean,
season?
Estonia is an interesting model to look at. They're obviously a much smaller country than us, and they also have a very rigorous, national ID system, which we do not have. So there are things that we would have to do, I think, to ensure the integrity of that type of election here in the States, to include getting some kind of standard validation around voter identification, which is a very controversial topic given our history with vote suppression. But perhaps the Real ID initiative is something that will help get us to a place where we're confident in using state identification for federal elections.
Well, one thing I've heard talked about from uh, folks on both sides of that very contentious debate is that one thing we probably could figure out how to do in a secure way is to get people a ballot online that they could then print off at home and drop off at a facility like a post office or something, in a secure way where you wouldn't, come in within 6 feet of other folks and so on. So I think there's kind of baby steps we could take to online voting that could be done now. It could get us part of the way there until we figure out some of the technical issues with getting us all the way there.
Yeah, I think there's certainly nothing on the shelf right now that would get us there by November. And so those kind of middle of the road measures that give us that social distancing, that give us the integrity we want, would be a great compromise.
When you look at voting online, obviously one of the things with Estonia, like you said, is their national ID is very, very rigorous. They do obtain biometrics on.
It's a smart card. Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's
got very high encryption on it. So
indeed, and the citizens there are also willing to take kind of a privacy at a, I mean, let's not forget that Estonia was the old Georgia. But kind of, Jake, bringing this kind of over to you, is there a role for DEF CON in testing some of the mobile voting technologies that have cropped up in the last few years and really authenticating them so that they can become a powerhouse, maybe not in this upcoming election, but in the 2022 midterms?
Well, so I guess first off, we don't certify, or we don't even call what we do assessments. The But we have an open door policy to anybody who wants to bring their technology in to DEF CON, to have folks take it apart, hack it, beat on it, whatever you think, talk about it. And we have an open invitation to both, or certainly to all the mobile voting companies that are out there, and we'd love to have them participate.
But there's definitely a role, I think, for this type of testing, and I mean, obviously, Synack is a crowdsourced solution, and so we like having more eyes on the targets and getting that diversity of talent to analyze it, and taking that offensive approach where, you put ourselves in the adversary's shoes and say, if we were the Russians wanting to influence this election and this were the voting system we needed to attack and we needed to carry out an attack at scale, how would we do that? Because the reality is that there are really smart people in these other countries that are our enemies that are really focused on doing that. That is their full-time job. And so unless we're putting ourselves in that same situation when we're doing our security assessments, we're not gonna prevent the adversary from carrying out their attacks. It's a little it's a little concerning that our election machines, the voting machines that are used, have no requirements to go through security audits before they're purchased by a state. And I think that's one of the major policy gaps that we should consider. And I think the work that DEF CON's done over the years has really highlighted the need for a major overhaul of how we do supply chain and security assessments on voting machines that are being picked up for everything from local to federal elections.
Right, and we've seen that with the CMMC model now for defense contractors, but we don't see it in elections. And there's almost that line that no one really wants to draw, right? Which is, how much should the federal government be involved in setting standards for elections, and does that give the appearance of the federal government trying to run elections? Because most people, and I think for anyone who's watching this or listening who isn't a U.S. national, I don't think they comprehend that the federal government doesn't run U.S. elections, but each individual county runs his own elections and they pick their own devices. So from a scale of trying to hack devices in the U.S. election, it's very difficult to do it massively because every county exercises and uses a different technology, different voting machines, and they're entitled to do so. And so that line between federal government and kind of setting some sort of standard and then letting counties make those decisions, how do we start to kind of break down that barrier so that people trust the recommendations of the federal government and understand that in this era we have to secure those machines and that local counties don't have the resources to do it?
Well, I mean, I would actually go back to something Mark said, which is uh, having things be open source. Frankly, at this point, I think is really um, our only way forward, because there just are so many jurisdictions. While there aren't um, a ton of voting machine companies, there's only a handful. There are a bunch of different makes and models, and while there are new ones that are more secure than old ones, we still have the old ones being used all over the place. Um, and on top of that, you've got voter registration databases, the election software that's used, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that while we have voting machine companies who are making everything from the software to the machines to everything else, are able to operate kind of in darkness as to having anybody really understand what security measures, if any, they have in place. um, we're never going to have um, the level of trust in election security that we need. Whereas if we were to open source the technology, could have a level of comfort knowing that people who do understand this stuff, who are not paid by the voting machine companies or anybody else, but care about this issue, are in there looking at it and will raise alarm bells if they see egregious errors, would not only go an incredibly long way to securing the technology, but I think probably even more importantly would go a long way to um, increasing the kind of cognitive security of the voting population, that they believe in the integrity of the elections.
Well, and that, we've seen that be successful in other models too. I mean, the internet that we're talking on right now is made up of standards. Like, these standards are open source. The government weighs in on these standards and gets buy-in from industry on these standards. The same thing could be done here for election security purposes. And then you'll see an industry crop up around that open source standard to support it, to build products on top of it that give certain insights. Maybe you give graphs and results that could be broadcast to TV in real time, because we love our real-time vote tallying. But there are certainly ways to do this that are proven through other technology areas that we just need to bring to this field and break down those walls.
Yeah, and I think, and if I can shamelessly plug my book here, Democracy in Danger, one of the things I argue for at the end um, is to really kind of build on what Mark just said and institute not just national but global standards on election security. Because while we may worry more about nation states and other types of hackers here in the U.S. and in many developing countries, they're worried about just straight up old-fashioned corruption around
Yeah.
their elections and how they're administered. And if they had open source voting technology that had global standards like we do with the internet, um, uh, administered around it, and open, and technologists from their country or others being able to look at how that technology is implemented and the code and everything else, it would not only make their elections more secure, like we're talking about here, but also make I think the voters in those countries feel like their elections are actually more honestly run, and that their elected leaders are who they intended to vote for.
I kind of want to transition a little bit from the election security piece to the last few weeks and this COVID-19 pandemic, because I think this is kind of once a century. There's something that transforms civilization, transforms industry, transforms standards of living. Um, Many believe this is it. How have you seen like policies around vulnerability disclosures and crowdsourced security testing progress over the last few weeks? Now that people are, in quarantine, isolated, air travel is down 90%. There's no traffic. I can't hear cars anymore. I hear more trucks than cars. So
That's a
how
nice benefit.
it is the no dead deers in my backyard from trucks hitting them. So it's great. But um, but how has the last few weeks really changed that and transitioned it?
Well, I think people start to recognize that the knowledge economy is full of people that can provide their work remotely, right? And work from home is an effective tool at tapping into talent, and doing that at a scale that you haven't been able to before. So you're seeing more people transition to understanding that workforce can be mobile, they can be effective while they're mobile. And for Synack, where we've crowdsourced penetration testing, remote penetration testing is something that's becoming more and more popular, especially in an era where you're not sending consultants and auditors on site. So this is going to increase the effectiveness of pen testing globally, I think, because you're going to see more people realize we can do this remotely, we can do it continuously, and tying this back into election infrastructure and vulnerability disclosure. You're going to see that folks need to keep these online services operational and secure. And so, I'm seeing like California State Assembly working on a bill called AB 2564 that requires agencies and businesses to have vulnerability disclosure policies, and that provides an outlet for researchers that are out there to report vulnerabilities that they find on systems that they use and systems they care about. And this is, very similar to what DEF CON has been doing with the election infrastructure and the voting village. But this is exactly what we need to be doing to make sure that the online services that we rely upon are continuously tested, and we have outlets for researchers that find critical vulnerabilities in them.
Yeah, and actually to that end, one of the things we did last year that we're planning to expand this year is we tried to kind of arrange marriages, so to speak, between some of the hackers at DEF CON and election officials, many of whom flew out on their own dime, got a hotel room at DEF CON on their own dime, bought their own ticket, just because they're so desperate to find people who can help them with their security, um, that they were willing to come out to Vegas in August, and again on their own dime, because in a lot of these counties, again, remember we're talking about over 8,000 election jurisdictions. even if they have the budget, which they don't, they can't find an election, or I mean, a security expert to help them. And so, as a last resort, they were turning to us to find volunteers, literally volunteers, who are going to help them with this stuff. And so, we're planning to expand that this year. You know, I think thankfully there's counties who do have a security budget, and can bring in folks like the folks at Synack to come in and look at their infrastructure and help them. You know, in some of these small rural counties where their budget is $100, um, you know, they have no other option besides volunteers, and so we're hoping to provide some of that support in an expanded way this go around. Um, Basically because we have this great asset, which is 30,000 technologists who convene on Vegas, and thousands of which seem to deeply care about election security. And so we're hoping to arrange those marriages this year. That being said, let me just make the point that if you can hire a firm that does this for a living, like Synack, you should do that. Volunteers are something that we're doing as a last resort because some folks just have no other option.
Well, Synack actually does have a something that Mark and I spoke about at RSA last month. Who would have? It's been a month since RSA, and the world is
Can't believe it.
different, man. At RSA, social distancing wasn't a thing. Mark and I weren't even 6 feet apart. We were across from each. We shook hands. We didn't even elbow bump. And now here we are. But Mark, you guys have an initiative for counties from a vulnerability testing. You want to just kind of mention that again, please?
We do. We have a pro bono initiative where we're working with anybody that needs it at the local state level to do security testing for election infrastructure. This is, you know, like we were saying earlier, there are a lot of people in the security research community that want to help with this problem. And we're providing that outlet, and we're connecting the dots through our technology platform where we can tap into researchers who live anywhere in the world and bring them and connect them to these systems and allow them to hack on them and find vulnerabilities. And so for states that may not have the budget, we are offering pro bono services to do a pen test on some of their assets related to the voting infrastructure. This is really great for things like voter registration databases and applications as well, beyond the voting machines themselves, which generally aren't hyper connected to the internet. But the applications that support the back end of the elections, they're most of the time on the internet, and it's really a scale issue trying to assess all of our 50 states and all their different topologies and infrastructure. And so, you know, we're hoping we can be part of the solution.
So
That's awesome.
that is absolutely great. I hope that more and more counties hear this, or people who know people who work in counties, and just say, "Hey, go to Synack and just have those guys do this pro bono testing for you," to at least understand where you're. You know, if nothing else, understand where you're vulnerable and be able to prepare for that rainy day. Because
it's not too late, right? We still have months ahead of the November election season, and so anything critical, we can hopefully put mitigations in that can help.
yeah, it's never too late. Do you guys think there's more support giving how the market dynamics are now really changing, and how, you know, you hear constantly from the White House right now, they want to get America back to work by Easter, which is, you know, when this will air on the virtual summit, this will be, you know, 10 days from when people see this, which seems really soon. But the dynamics of working from home and that transition doesn't make that really far-fetched. But do you think there's more support giving the rapidly changing market dynamics of how everything is moving right now, for more remote work, for more vulnerability testing, for CISOs being even more open to do this remotely, when before they, like you said earlier, Mark, they want the consultant and the auditor in-house. Now they're just like, hey, I still have to get this audit done. I'm really not going to get an extension.
Right. Well, the reality is you're not going to get an extension on your audits. You still have to do that by the deadline. As far as I know, today we'll see how things look next week. But you know, this is certainly a time to look at other staffing solutions. You know, if you can't hire the team or you don't have enough staff, this is the Synack model is a great one to tap into. You know, people that you ordinarily wouldn't have access to. and it's completely turnkey. I also see a shift towards more cloud services where we're going to have to start to worry about how people securely connect to these resources, and we're going to be looking at remote connection technology and even technology on this security of these services that we rely upon. That's even more critical now because without that, you really don't have your workforce supporting your business. So it's really important that we open our eyes to this changing work paradigm, that remote work and distributed work is likely going to be a heavy component in our future, and let's make the most of it, and let's make it secure.
Jake, what do you think about this whole? Do you think there's going to be more resources? Do you see how maybe possibly how the voting village, who's been a really helpful mechanism for exposing a lot more vulnerabilities, or does it really create animosity between vendors and researchers now? And will it be different this year than years before?
Well, you mean in general or specific to remote work?
I think in
I
general.
guess there's two different. Okay.
I think let's look at it from a vulnerability disclosure and perspective.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess people should remember where we started. So where we started was right after 2016 with a whole host of election officials and vendors saying that the machines were unhackable and again air gapped. And so and and anybody who did go do any security testing on a machine had to sign an NDA that basically promised if they talked about anything they found, which is why, of course, a few years later, and I think the third DEF CON that we did, the Voting Village, we found vulnerabilities that had been disclosed to the vendors 10 years previous and were still in machines that were being used currently, that election cycle back in, I think, 18 or 19. So it's not like there was some symbiotic relationship previous to this, or that really there was any openness to letting researchers come in and look at these machines and talk publicly at all about anything that was going on. So what we have been able to do um, is identify vulnerabilities and let the public know about it, and most of all, let election officials know about it, because probably the scariest thing about all this is that the election officials themselves didn't know about any of these vulnerabilities, and so now the customers of the vendors have been able to say, "Hey, have you fixed this? And what are you doing to fix that?" And so on and so forth.
I stop you there for a second.
Sure, sure.
You opened a can of worms. I'm gonna
Oh,
come
no.
right at you. So
Okay.
COVID-19 is bringing a lot of the globalization discussions back to maybe onshoring or nearshoring, right? So people are starting to look at Mexico and Central America as better, more secure options than, for example, stuff being made in China. Do you see that? We're not going to see any difference in 2020, obviously, for this election cycle. But do you see that maybe by the next presidential election, by 2024, this stuff will be onshored or near sourced?
Um, you know, I doubt it. It's so hard um, to do that stuff in a way that is economically feasible for the people who are buying it, that I think it's nearly impossible. I mean, where my hope lies in this whole evolution is kind of back to this open source thing. It's that some really smart people are going to come up with open source technology that can run on COTS equipment, um, like an iPad or something that can scan ballots, and have open source voting software that runs in a cloud or something like that. That guys like all the folks who work for Mark can go in and look at all day and beat on all they want. I mean, I think that's far more likely to be a workable solution that's going to fit within the budgets people have than trying to onshore vote tallying hardware.
Right. And I think in the absence of that, if we don't get there, we need to have a backup plan of just doing more aggressive assessments on this infrastructure. So if the machine is made in China, we get that manufacturing is cheaper there. We're not going to be able to fix that overnight, but we have to be able to assess that supply chain and make sure that we're not receiving machines that have backdoors in them. And you're seeing the Pentagon look at this issue as well through their CMMC initiatives, where they're looking at their software supply chain and analyzing the software down to the module level of what is in the systems that they're procuring. And it's surprising that analysis isn't being done across other critical infrastructure areas. But it's definitely an improvement I would like to see in the next several years from a policy perspective.
Yeah, so let me just, if you don't mind, like double down on that and emphatically. So there's unfortunately a not insignificant part of the election administration world, whether it be election administrators themselves or vendors or whoever, who take what I refer to as the Chinese Communist Party approach to security, meaning they don't want anybody to talk about any vulnerabilities that are out there, and anybody who does, they say they're adding to the problem and making it worse. Well, we saw with COVID-19 that that's actually the wrong approach, and it's the same issue applies here with election security. I think we've found that over decades and decades of testing and so on, that actually sunshine is the best antiseptic, and the more that we can highlight our problems and address them, the better off we all are.
Right, you can't solve a problem if no one's talking about it. There's,
That's right.
like you said around COVID-19, I think if they were just honest about it from the very beginning, from late November, early December, they say 80% of the infections would have been prevented at this point, and this would have been handled at the point of origin rather than what it is today, which is it's shut down the global commerce and really brought upon an unneeded recession at a time when we were probably having the best global economy that this world's ever seen.
Well, and I remember, I think it was the second, I think it was DEF CON 18. I think it was the second year that we did DEF CON, and we were getting hammered by the vendors for, you know, telling the public about vulnerabilities and so on. And it was actually Rob Joyce at that time, who was still at NSA, who during one of his talks, which had nothing to do with us, stood up and said, by the way, you know that room down the hallway where they're hacking into the voting machines? Well, guess what? Our adversaries have a room just like that. And I'm
True.
paraphrasing here, but you know that room is active 365 days a year, not 2.5 days a year like DEF CON's room is.
I think that realistic perspective is needed. I mean, we have to remember these nation states have a lot of resources, and for strategic problems they care about, like who gets elected president in the United States, they have a lot of people working on that.
Well, it's not just president, it's also Congress and Senate, and everyone's so focused on POTUS, but you influence more in Congress and Senate sometimes than you do with POTUS policy. And so that's also something where, even in some of the research communities I'm a part of, you start to see the fake Twitter handles or the fake websites and profiles that get put up that are, supporting one congressional candidate over another one in different places, either, and it's happening on both sides of the aisle, which I think is really important to point out. This is happening to the Republicans, and it's also happening to the Democrats. And the whole purpose of this is to sow division in our nation. And right now, at this time where our nation's really is coming together, it's actually, and I'll end it on this. We're on a bright note, because I want to see Jake actually crack a smile.
We have
Um,
the solutions. We just need to do it.
yes, we have the solutions. We just need to do it. We're seeing corporations, organizations like Synack and DEF CON and so many others step up to the plate to help any way they can in dealing with this. Manufacturers are producing stuff that we desperately need in order to save lives. And America's coming together, like, I think, I don't want to say as never before, because I felt like after 9/11, this nation really did come together, no matter what divisions it did. But that was more of a terrorist act. But this here is a healthcare issue, and the enemy here is invisible. It's a virus. And so, having said that, this country has come together, and people have come together, and here we are. American Ingenuity, we're doing a virtual summit online at a time like this, social distancing at its best, and still being able to talk about really important topics and how we deal with them, and talk about solutions and not just the problems. And so, we ought to be grateful for that.
Absolutely.
Gentlemen, I want to say thank you so much for your time. Folks, Jake and Mark, who are just, powerhouses that you guys can obviously interact with. And Jake, I can't wait for DEF CON. Like, it's the one conference a year I look forward to, is going to DEF CON. And I was okay if they would have canceled RSA. I'd be crushed if COVID-19 postpones or cancels DEF CON. Crushed. Guys, thank you so much. Hey, everyone. Next session coming up here just after a brief break. Until that one, folks, thank you so much for tuning in. Mark, Jake, thanks so much for coming on. More after the break right now, folks.